Hello, and welcome to Portals to the Past. I'm your host, Will Hickox of the Watkins Museum of History. Portals to the Past is a series of interviews with historical figures significant to the border region. This series is a partnership between Humanities Kansas, Freedom's Frontier National Heritage Area, and the Watkins Museum of History. Today's event is also part of Civil War on the Western Frontier. Today, through a miracle of technology, we are able to travel backward in time and interview one of the famed Buffalo Soldiers. These regiments of African-American servicemen have marched their way into history and legend. Our guest is Private Isaac Johnson of the 9th Cavalry. We'll start off with an introduction by Private Johnson, followed by some questions. We encourage you, the audience members, to get involved by posting questions for our guest in the Q&A feature. And we ask you to use the Q&A feature and not the chat feature. We may not have time to address all of your questions, but we'll do our best. And now I'd like to say welcome to Private Johnson, and I wonder if you could tell us a little about yourself.
Well, first, thanks for having me. You know, I've had an impression a long time that people that do all the talking don't learn much more than they knew before. So this morning I'm going to talk, and I can just hope you're going to learn a little bit more about what it was like to take that trip, the longest trip of my life, from being enslaved to being a soldier. Well, things started off with a big ruckus when I was born. You see, I was born between two hurricanes. In September, the Harris hurricane came through North Carolina and did a bad job on everything. A month later in October, here comes the Great Havana hurricane. Now everybody remembers my being born in between those two. But worse than that, the day I was born, I lost my mother and I lost my sister, my twin sister. So life started off rather hard, and really, being enslaved was what was normal. I never left the plantation. I do remember that punishment was stern, so everybody was always doing their job and on their best behavior, or you'd be taken to the post. There was a wooden platform halfway between the quarters and the big house, and there, in the middle of that platform, was a post sticking straight up out the dirt. And if they tied you to that post, it was going to be a long, bad day. Well, I avoided that because I learned early. Just keep your head down, keep quiet, do your work. And I did the best to be invisible that I could. First time I ever left the plantation, a day I'll never forget. It was full of wonder because I'd never seen a thing outside the place. But that day, I saw my only known relative sold away from me. Emmeline had been my sister all my life. She had raised me. She was there for me. By the time I returned home that night, she was no longer there. I don't know where she went. I did get a glimpse of her as she was leaving, in tears, with chains on her wrist. Her back was turned. She didn't see me. I never saw her again in my life. Well, after that, I felt like I had no place that I could say I belonged. And as things turned out, I was gifted to the daughter of my master, and we moved to Montgomery, Alabama. That was different from North Carolina. There, I learned a job, became a clerk. I was helping out around the store. Emmeline was the head of the household because her husband, he had died, left her with a little baby girl. So it was me, Emma Clark, her daughter, and this boarder that was living in the house. He was a huckster from Pennsylvania. It was through him that I heard that word right after the Civil War had ended and freedom had come, but that was a strange thing. Freedom, I didn't know what it was, because the things I saw and the way things were, they didn't change much. You still had to follow those same rules. Your behavior was always going to be questioned. And if you got out of line, you could still get whooped or worse. But I was real glad when I heard the word that Black African Africans were going to join the army. I didn't understand that at all. That was as puzzling to me as freedom was. Because what was it going to be like, me wearing a blue uniform? And Lord knows if I carried a gun in Alabama, I wasn't going to make it to sundown. But as it turned out, I mustered all my courage and I signed up. Well, I couldn't write. Captain Bloodgood wrote his name and I put an X right in between his name. That was good enough. I found myself in Jefferson Barracks. That's right outside of St. Louis in a little place called Lee, Missouri, just off the Mississippi River. Pretty place, all cut and green and clean everywhere. And there was more black folks there than I had ever seen, and they're all in uniform. Well, there was some 10th Cavalry there and the 38th Infantry. That's what I was in. 38th Infantry, Company K. I signed up May 6, 1867. I became a soldier. That's the first time I ever felt like I was a man. From there, they moved us across Missouri to Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. It was too amazing. Didn't know what to think of it because it looked like a real fort, an old fort, a big fort. We were living in a swamp there. Malaria, cholera, dysentery, diarrhea was everywhere because post commander didn't care much for us colored soldiers, didn't think we belonged, and he wasn't going to give us anything and make us do it on our own. We even asked to put down planks so we wouldn't have to walk in the mud of the swamp. Denied. Got the worst horses, worst equipment. This old uniform was a hand-me-down from the Civil War, but I was proud of it. Gold buttons on my jacket, boots. I even like my big hat. From there, we had to move on. And we were sent further into Kansas to Fort Hays, at Hays City, Kansas. It was there that I was assigned with 3 other guys to guard the mail. We were gonna go along the Santa Fe Trail, crossing Cow Creek, right outside of Lyons, Kansas, in Rice County. We were ambushed. I took a bullet, wounded, but we fought our way through it. We got away. But we continued for another 642 miles with that wound patched up before I could see a doctor. That was at Fort Union, New Mexico. Now that place was special. I mean, coming out of Carolina and Alabama and then seeing no trees at all, but this place, Fort Union, stood out there on the prairie, just all by itself, just gleaming and beautiful. Big American flag flying up in the middle of the parade ground. All we had to do for a while was just to muster, practice, drill, work. Muster, practice, drill, work. Wasn't much for the infantry to do. We would guard railroads and their crew, strung thousands of miles of telegraph wire, built roads, built forts, repaired many more. But all in all, we worked through it. And after my 3 years was up, looked like everybody was leaving the 38th. I mean, we'd all been recruited about the same time. So about the same time, we were gonna leave. They've got down, I understand, before it was over to 38 men from over 800 because they couldn't get them in fast enough and we were leaving much faster. I wasn't gonna stay. I went back to Montgomery for a while, worked there, went on into Mississippi, and met Sally Walls, love of my life. She's in Walls, Mississippi, on the Walls Plantation. We got married, moved to Holly Springs, Mississippi, and then over in Arkansas. But as time went on, things got hard, and I re-upped into the 9th Cavalry. After you've been in the infantry, you know you don't want to walk that far no more. And those guys on horseback, they were everywhere and they saw all the action. Well, I was proud to be with them, the 9th Cavalry. In a 5-year enlistment, though, I only made it 3 years because that wound in my shoulder prevented me from being able to fully perform all my duties. Now, I didn't get discharged under anything but honorable conditions. It took a while and a few lawyers, including one right out of Yates City, Kansas, that took my case and got me my pension. My pension was land. I got land in Arkansas, a little place called Menifee. So me, my wife, Sally, and some of her relatives moved in and started that town of Menifee. Well, I was a farmer. I had gone from being illiterate, nothing but a piece of property, to being a soldier, and now being a literate landowner. So that's a pretty long trip from beginning to end. I guess when I was born, nothing like that was ever thought about, that we be free or that we serve our nation. That's the story.
Excellent. Well, that's a very powerful story that you tell, Private Johnson. And I wonder if you could elaborate on the reasons why you enlisted. Were you motivated by patriotism, economic circumstances, or other factors?
I didn't know much about patriotism. I wasn't a citizen when I joined. It just didn't seem like it applied to us colored folks because we were in the United States Colored Troops. I joined because, one, it was steady pay. Oh yeah, they said $13 a month. They actually paid us colored guys only 10. And we had to spend some of that on our uniforms and upkeep of our equipment, things that the white soldiers didn't have to worry about. It was put on us to take care of it. But it gave me a place, it gave me a home, gave me a reason, gave me a purpose, gave me a job. I had food, place to stay. Most of all, it made me know that I wasn't just property, that I was a man. I was out there making sure the white folks were safe on the frontier. And there were plenty of black folks came out that way too. But what's amazing, way out west, we still ran upon a lot of prejudice, even from the people we were there to protect. So I joined because it was an opportunity and I wanted something different from everything I'd ever known. And that was the time that the Army gave me that chance. The United States gave me that chance. We had earned it. In the Civil War, our gallantry, the fighting that we had done, we became recognized as colored troops. And we were recognized when Congress authorized 6 regiments of colored troops. And I was very fortunate to be able to join. Some folks walked from South Carolina to Louisiana to join. That trip wasn't quite that bad, but it was just as rewarding to be accepted, to go out, join, and that's when I felt patriotism.
That's amazing. So the 6 regiments of black troops on the frontier that you mentioned are earning a reputation and a legend, really, and they're known as Buffalo Soldiers. And I wonder, I don't believe you've used that term, but that's a term that other folks have used. And I wonder if you could explain to us how they came to be called, how your units came to be called the Buffalo Soldiers.
Well, Will, when I joined in 1867, no, we were the U.S. Colored Troops. But it was along the way, and it was really something around Hays, Kansas, that the fighting and the engagements that the colored troops found themselves in with bandits, outlaws, desperados, with the Native Americans that were there, we were on our own and we held our own. And in so doing, it was right about the time I got out, around 1870, we started hearing this about wild buffalo. That's what they were calling us, wild buffalo. And that was changed by the time I got back and re-entered in 1878 into the Cavalry. We were Buffalo Soldiers. So yeah, I was there before and during.
Excellent. So my understanding is that the officers of these regiments are primarily white men, and I'm wondering why that is. And do you have any? I'm asking you several questions here, I guess. Do you have any black leaders? And what is the relationship like between the white leaders and the black enlisted troops?
Mostly good. Now, I always had good leaders. Captain Bloodgood he was a very dedicated officer. All of our officers had experience in battle, and they were great leaders. Now, they had to work very hard because of practically all of us being illiterate. There was nobody to handle the reports but the officers themselves. Therefore, the training and the drilling, those things were pretty much left up to. We had an engagement. But our second engagement, we were ready. We started really coming together as a good troop. Well, why they were white officers was because there hadn't been a black officer through the Civil War. There hadn't been one since. But when I went back in to the 9th Cavalry, we did have one. He was with the 10th Cavalry, the first one to graduate from West Point. Henry O. Flipper. Flipper was a good officer. Now, I heard word about some of those white officers that carried a little bit more home with them than we might have wanted to be, because they were sometimes pretty cool. And some of those officers were actually discharged dishonorably because of their treatment of their black troops. But overall, no. They had to be highly qualified. They were war and battle tested. So these were good officers, and they were carefully selected, and they were good to their troops, and they took care of their troops, and we took care of them. You know, as a matter of fact, we won more, especially the 9th Cavalry, more Medal of Honor recipients than any other unit in the West. And a lot of those times were because that gallantry that we demonstrated was going back to save our officers and get them out of harm's way, wounded, and never leave a soldier behind. So we repaid their loyalty to us with a fierce loyalty to our officers.
That's wonderful. So questions are starting to roll in from the audience, and many audience members would like to know more about yourself. And we have a question here. How did you learn to read? This question is from Heather. She would like to know how you learned to read.
That's a good question. Because, yeah, I couldn't even sign my name on my enlistment papers, but I could make an X. The difference in the colored troops and all the other white regiments in the Army was that a chaplain would be assigned to a post, stayed at that post, did his chaplain duties from that one place. But the chaplains assigned to the Buffalo Soldiers traveled with us. When we went, they went. And part of their duty outside of taking care of our souls was to teach us to read and write. Now, fascinating about that was, unless a man was on duty or out on assignment, he never missed a class. We were very, very eager to learn, and the opportunity that the Army was giving us to learn to read, something so special that we did our very best, and we helped each other. And I came out of the Army able to read and write. So I got to thank them for that. I mean, in Alabama and North Carolina, it was against the law. And here, the law of the land, the United States government, was teaching us how to read and write and do simple, basic math. It was good.
We have a question from Holly, and she says, my 12-year-old would like to know who is ambushing you. So I think this is referring to the incident at Cow Creek that you mentioned earlier.
Yeah. Well, Holly, you tell him I said that we were surprised by some of the Indians that were in the area. Right at Cow Creek, of course, it runs through the lowest part of the prairie right there. Tree line, very heavy tree line just along the creek. And over the Golden Rise through these fields, here they come. They come firing and they come hollering. So we rushed across the creek, stood to the other side. The Indians on one side, us firing back from the other. That's why I got wounded. But in all that fire, that didn't seem to last too long, but while it was going on, it seemed like it lasted all day. I didn't even know I was shot. It was after that I felt warm inside my blouse on my right side. Never felt the pain until they started to take that bullet out. Then I felt it. But we held them across the creek until I suppose they just said it wasn't worth it or it wasn't going to accomplish what they wanted. So the Indians in the area, they slowly took off, went back over that rise. And we took off too, heading toward New Mexico. We were alive and glad to be. But it was a surprise attack by the Indians from the area.
Private Johnson, Jim would like to know, well, he starts off by saying, you enlisted in 1867. Were there many black soldiers who had enlisted during the Civil War who remained in the service and went on to the West? And so were they already there when you arrived? And did you have other Civil War veterans in the regiment with you?
Yes, we did. Those battle-tested soldiers were normally our non-commissioned officers, our sergeants, our corporals. These guys were the ones that really took the drills in hand and taught us how to be soldiers. They had been through it, they lived through it, they were good at it. They whipped us into a fighting force in short time. But we had many of them that had come out of the Civil War from different organizations. You see, Colonel Grierson, who was over the 10th Cavalry, he was recruiting folks from the East. And he was bringing them in, trying to bring in the best and the brightest that he could get. But how many people want to leave civilization in the East when they don't know anything but what they've heard and it wasn't too good about going out West? So we were able to get a lot of soldiers back in, but as far as civilians that were professionals or clerks or able to read and write, not so much from the East. But folks like me, we joined gladly and we worked hard. So it was a combination, and we all looked up to and we all listened to those soldiers that had been in the Civil War.
Certainly. We have another question here, and I wonder if I can actually combine it with a different question. How long were you stationed at Fort Hays, Kansas? But I wonder if you could elaborate on this and tell us a little bit about what life is like on a frontier army post.
Oh my goodness, rough. Everything was rough. You gotta respect all the guys that were out there on the frontier. I know we may think of us as being the law and order or a lawless West, but some areas were pretty tough. Fort Hays was one of the toughest, roughest cities that gave the West its reputation for a big shootout town. And it was also a lot of racial strife. Now, thing of it is, some of the Buffalo soldiers felt that they didn't have to put up with that anymore, and they pushed back. And of course, the citizens, they well appreciated the fact that we were there to protect them because there were a lot of Indian raids going on. And Fort Hays was kind of spread out, and it was open prairie. So it was prone to attack, easy to attack. And we stood there as the guards between the raiding Indians and the citizens. But the citizens weren't always happy about that. They were happy to have us when we were fighting, and they were happy for us to go back to the post when it was over and stay there. But you also had those soldiers that felt that it was our job to prove ourselves and to be patient with those that didn't show us patience. And we did persevere, but yeah, it was dirty. You had rain, bugs, critters of all kinds. You slept with bed bugs and anything else that could climb up pant leg and take a bite on you at night. But while we were there, it was much, much more important And what we had to put up with was just what everybody had to put up with in the wilderness. The frontier was a brand new place for all of us. And so one suffered as much as another, whether in service or not.
So we have a question from Lori, and there was a fairly long gap between the two periods of your service in the Army. And was the military different in 1878 than it was in 1867 when you first enlisted?
Now, that's an excellent question. You know, I've never had anybody ask me that. I did leave because being in the infantry was an awful hard thing to do. Matter of fact, the way that the Indians described us was that those that had yellow on their uniform like I do, they called them yellow legs instead of cavalry. And if you had light blue, then you were infantry. And their name for infantry was walker heat, because that's what you did. You walked the heat. Well, after I had walked hundreds of miles carrying about 70 pounds on my back and a 15-pound rifle, and seeing these horse soldiers ride by me looking great, I was not going to stay in the infantry. I did get out. I went back to civilization, but civilization was still harsh, very harsh. It was not a good place for a black man. If it was bad on the frontier, it was much worse back east, east of the Mississippi. It was just an unforgiving place for a black man. And it was a dangerous place if you were a veteran soldier, because people then feared that you were not one of theirs anymore, and that their control over you was questionable, whether or not I would fight back knowing how to fight, or whether or not I carried weapons. It wasn't comfortable. So I tried my hand at being a civilian for a good 6 years, and 8 years, excuse me, and found out that it was just too hard to scratch out a living. And I was making it hard on my family. So I went back to where there was some security. And that time, of course, joining the Cavalry, it was going to be better than it had been before. And I think it really was. But it was a hard life either way, but much better out in the West than it was back east.
Very interesting. So we have, I wonder if we'll do one more question and then we'll go into the second part of the interview here. And this is a very interesting one, and I've wondered this quite often myself. What is your relationship like with the Native Americans? Of course, you had to fight certain tribes or groups of tribes at times. Someone would like to know, could you expand on talking about that relationship, and did you have any friendships with Native people?
We didn't have the friendships, but what we did have was a kinship of warriors. You know, Native Americans, they always appreciated your skill as a warrior, and that would elevate you in the tribe. And the same thing was true about the Army in their eyes. If you were a warrior of particularly good note, then that was appreciated. I mean, we still fought one another to the death if we had to, but at the same time, one warrior appreciates another. And that to me really explains why they wanted to call us Wild Buffalo, because there is a spirit that they believe in with the buffalo that is sacred. It's important. It's part of their lives. It's central to their lives, the buffalo. I don't take that name lightly. Now, of course, some of the white soldiers thought it was very comical and that they would laugh about it, but we took it quite seriously. And we wore that as a badge of honor. And even on the 10th Cavalry patch, it has the buffalo up right on it. I mean, we adopted that. But the warlike ability of the Buffalo Soldiers was something that the Indians weren't used to seeing. They hadn't fought people like that before, that had the tenacity, that was like a wounded buffalo. And if a buffalo is dangerous, at 2 tons of running muscle that can outrun a horse and cut faster than a man, and if they came for you, they would trample you to death. And a wounded buffalo is even worse. A cornered buffalo, the worst beast in the West you could find. So this name really represented a respect. But no, we didn't have a relationship. We did not have tea parties. We weren't gonna go to a cookout. And it was a very strange relationship that we had come from bondage, and we were there to put others in bondage. It was a hard thing to do because we understood very well that there was little difference between a plantation and a reservation except the name. And that wasn't a good feeling. And if there was an opportunity to fight and still spare as many as you could, as long as your mission was complete, we would go that way instead of total annihilation. We weren't about that. So yeah, it's complicated, very complicated. It's like fighting a neighbor. It's like fighting not necessarily a friend, but someone that we respected as much as they respected us.
That's excellent. Wow. So I've been deeply affected by this interview, and I think our audience has as well. And now I would like to transition to the second part of the interview. But first of all, I want to thank you, Private Johnson, for that excellent interview. And now I would like to introduce George Pettigrew. And I'd like George to talk about, to step out of character and to tell us about the special connection that you have with Isaac Johnson, and also talk about the organization you belong to. And also we had an audience question, what's the deal with those first sergeant stripes if you're portraying a private?
Well, actually, I did start off as a private, and I ended up as a private. But as a member of the Alexander chapter of Buffalo Soldiers in Kansas City, and also a member of the 9th and 10th Horse Cavalry Association, then my rank there is first sergeant. So what I portray is a private, never more. Brave soldier, but never raised in rank. And what you see now is because I'm executive vice president of that Alexander Madison chapter. What was the other part of that question? It was a multiple question.
Yeah, what's the special connection that you have with Isaac Johnson?
Yes, well, that's why I'm here. Isaac Johnson is my mother's grandfather. My mother's mother is the daughter of an original Buffalo soldier. That's Jenny Johnson. And it was just a year ago that I got to read the slave narratives that are part of the National Archives. And I actually got to hear her voice through the words that she spoke, talking about Isaac Johnson. My mother had long conversations often with her grandfather because he lived with the family, with her family when she was 15, he died. He died there. And she learned a lot, but she was that kind of person that her mind was always about finding out more. Eunice Davis Pettigrew was her name, and she was the one that got a lot of the research done back when doing research on Buffalo soldiers meant you had to travel to the states they were in. There was no internet. And for 40 years, she followed those stories. So I grew up with those stories. I grew into those stories. And then when I started researching them myself, I found out just how amazing that story is. That it's not just Isaac. Isaac's story is of a man that would be otherwise unknown completely, forgotten history, but was a part of something historical, something that changed America. And in so doing, changed the world. So this little 5'7", 140-pound man was making a way in his life, a better life, but was making a better life for America. And I just found the story compelling. So it's one that I participate in now as an oral historian, a certified oral storyteller, and a certified written storyteller. So his story is one of many. He wasn't a Medal of Honor winner. He wasn't a hero, except that he was a member of a group of heroes.
That's wonderful. Wow. Could you talk a little bit more about this organization, the Alexander Madison chapter, and what other activities that your group does?
Now that's an amazing story in itself. You see, there were a bunch of fellas here in Kansas City, Missouri, that were gathering at the Armory down in the 18th and Vine district. And the 18th and Vine district, outside of being famous and associated with 12th and Vine and the jazz of the early era, was also the place where the Negro Leagues baseball signed their first charter and was created. Down the street from the Armory was Mutual Musicians Foundation. That's where you had to go and get your card if you were going to play. And the greatest names in jazz came through those doors. And right on the corner from the Mutual Musicians is where the Buffalo Soldiers were born. You see, it was July 28, 1866 that Congress authorized what became the Buffalo Soldiers. And it was July 28, 1966, 100 years to the day, that fellas that had been part of the Buffalo Soldiers in World War II got together and wrote a charter. And when they did, it became the founding chapter of what today is the 9th and 10th Horse Cavalry Association. 21,000 members and 41 chapters, including one in Germany. So it has been well received, and there's even a branch off of a motorcycle group of Buffalo Soldier chapters. It's the largest Black motorcycle group of chapters in the world. So both find appreciation in their roots. And it's thanks to those fellas, James Alexander and James Madison, the two gentlemen that sat down and created what today we know as the Buffalo Soldier Association.
That's great. And so you've been gracious enough to do this presentation with us today. And we, at the Watkins Museum of History, where I work, we hosted you and several other members for a fantastic presentation last year. I wonder what other activities your group does. You mentioned that you're certified storytellers, and how does that play into your public outreach and the kind of activities you do for the public?
Well, what we do is we have a mission. And our mission, first of all, is never to let the story of the Buffalo Soldier go untold. And we do have three primary presenters. Donna Madison portrays Kathy Williams, the only woman documented to be a Buffalo Soldier that served in the infantry. As a matter of fact, she served in the 38th Infantry. And Isaac Johnson was there with her. Didn't know she was a woman because she hid it well. And Isaac at 5'7" had to look up to Kathy Williams. She was 5'9". And they say looked a lot like a man. But for 22 months, she pulled it off. And when discovered, they said that it was a fraud and the government wasn't going to stand for it. So they put her out. But all in all, our organization and John Bruce, we call him JR, he's our president. And in the 53 years that Alexander Madison has been a chapter, the founding chapter, he is only our second president. So we've got continuity in our organization. And we are very proud of that.
That's amazing. Maybe I'll just end by asking, George, how can folks get in contact with your group? Like, how can they find you on the internet? And how can they reach out to you? I know things are a little bit difficult right now in terms of booking presentations, but this video will live on beyond this moment. So if folks want to get a hold of your group and see what you can do with them, how would they get in touch with you?
BuffaloSoldiersKC.org is our website. And of course, they can always go to Freedom's Frontier, National Heritage Area. we're a member there as well. So, or get in contact with the Public Affairs Office at Fort Leavenworth. So we have multiple ways of doing it, and we are always, we welcome the opportunity to talk to schools, churches, organizations. It's next month, depending on how things turn out, on the 21st of September, we'll be in Wellington, Kansas at 6 p.m. And that will be our first face-to-face performance since March. But of course, that too depends on how things turn out.
Right.
But we are doing more and more by video, and we're glad to still be able to get that story out. So actually, the virus has given us a chance to take to a new medium, because we've been strictly in person heretofore. And also, you can get in touch with us by going to the Missouri Humanities Council, because we're part of the Speakers Bureau there. And just send us a note. Just get in touch with our friends and our associates, and we'll get in touch with you. We would appreciate the opportunity to bring our story.
That's excellent. And it's a wonderful organization, and you're doing tremendous work. And I just want to thank you, George, for being with us here today, for joining us on this time-traveling journey. And I want to invite everyone watching to join us later today for a Quantrill's Raid memorial video, which will be posted on the Watkins Museum of History Facebook page as part of Civil War on the Western Frontier at 1:30, as well as future Portals to the Past events. So thank you again to everyone, and bye for now.